Carol Baker. I'm the chair of the Jackson Pride Center. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight on this gorgeous evening to spend some time indoors like we've been doing all winter. But we have a special treat. We have Mr. Jay Kaplan from the ACLU of Michigan here. Jay's been the staff attorney for the ACLU of Michigan's LGBT project since its founding in 2001. He's worked on cases including challenging undercover sting operations targeting gay men, fighting Michigan's constitutional amendment prohibiting same-sex couples from marrying, defending the validity of second-parent adoptions granted in Michigan, and recently advocating for a transgender high school student to be able to run for prom court. Jay was honored in the 2006 Unsung Hero Award from the Michigan State Bar and the 2010 Virginia Uribe, thank you, Civil Rights Award from the National Education Association. Mr. Jay Kaplan, thank you.
Thank you very much. Without the microphone?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out on this beautiful evening. And I was telling some folks earlier, my first legal job in 1985 was for legal services in Jackson. So I know the street, Michigan Avenue, well. I was in the Harris building, and many times in my lunch hour I'd come to this library. So I haven't been back in about 30 years, at least in the downtown area. So it's nice to be back. And we have lots to talk about. A lot of things are happening. You know, I think after the marriage equality decision in 2015, certainly many members of the media, they thought, well, LGBT rights have been achieved. Equality, the story's over. There's nothing more to do. And I think a lot of times the attention, both of the media and even our own LGBT community, is not quite so attuned to what's going on. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about some of the good things that are happening, that have happened, particularly in the state of Michigan, and the challenges that we face. We face some very serious challenges. You know, for LGBT rights, we made incredible progress in the past decade, certainly culminating with the marriage equality decision, but also in having the federal government interpreting laws that protect LGBT people and developing policies that are supportive of being LGBT, and we're seeing reversals in some of those policies and those gains that have been made. So let's talk about some of the good news. I heard Carol talking to the interviewer about Jackson's Human Rights Ordinance, and that's terrific. I know that took a lot of hard work, took many years in trying to get the Jackson City Council to approve Human Rights Ordinance that included sexual orientation and gender identity. And these local ordinances are very, very important because even in this day and age, there are only 21 states that have civil rights laws that specifically prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Michigan is not one of those 21 states. We're one of the 29 states that don't have those protections. And in addition, we don't have any federal civil rights laws that specifically protect LGBT people. And that's why it's so important to have these local ordinances. Even if they don't have a lot of resources to provide remedies to redress discrimination, the fact they're on the books, the fact they send a message to the community that this kind of discrimination is not to be sanctioned, very, very important. And currently, I think we have 44 local communities in the state of Michigan that have these human rights ordinances. But something also interesting happened last year in the state of Michigan. It didn't get a lot of play within our own community. But the Michigan Civil Rights Commission in May of 2018, they issued an interpretive statement. So the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, it's set up according to Michigan statute, and the people that are on this commission, their duty is to interpret Michigan civil rights laws. So in their statement, they said that LGBT people were protected against discrimination under the category of sex discrimination. And what they then did, they directed the Michigan Department of Civil Rights to begin taking complaints of discrimination involving employment, housing, public accommodations that can include restaurants, doctors' offices, as well as education. That's huge. That's hugely significant. So for the first time ever in the state of Michigan, we have a statewide remedy when one is in the Department of Civil Rights. You can file your complaint. They will investigate. If they find that there has been a violation, they will then bring it before the commission, and the commission can issue findings, they can issue penalties and fines against the people, the individuals who are doing the discrimination. Now, I don't want you to think that the Civil Rights Commission just pulled this idea that discrimination against LGBT people is sex discrimination. This is a concept that we started to see in our courts almost 30 years ago. And it's under this legal theory called gender stereotyping. Let me explain it to you because I think it's going to make really good sense. So, in 1989, and Price Waterhouse argued, they said, no, this is not actionable, this kind of gender stereotyping. Title VII only covers when you treat a man different than a woman, and she's not alleging that, she's just saying she didn't get this promotion. And the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, agreed with Ann Hopkins, and they said that was actionable. They said any time that an employer uses sex as a consideration in making an employment discrimination, that can trigger civil rights laws that prohibit sex discrimination. So why am I giving the background about Price Waterhouse? Is because what we've seen in the last 30 years is a number of federal courts looking at discrimination against LGBT people and finding that often that involves gender stereotypes. So a gay or lesbian individual, they're not going to fit with some of society's gender stereotypes about how you might look, how you should act, who you should love. And certainly transgender people, based on who they are also not going to conform to those gender stereotypes about how one thinks someone who was assigned male at birth or female at birth should look, act, should present themselves. And so we've seen federal courts address this issue. Now, I mentioned to the United States Supreme Court, that's the highest Supreme Court in the land. The next level of federal courts is called the Circuit Court of Appeals. In Michigan, we're part of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And on 3 occasions, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals has looked at cases involving transgender discrimination. And they have found that that's sex discrimination, that violates civil rights laws prohibiting sex discrimination. And just last year, one of the ACLU cases went to the Sixth Circuit involving Amy Stevens, a transgender working at a funeral home when she came out as transgender. She had worked for this funeral home for 7 years, had an excellent reputation, very valued employee. She was living as her true female self outside of work, but she was afraid to present herself as female while she was at work. And finally, that disconnect got so difficult for her, and she became so depressed and so stressed out, she decided she needed to come out to her employer. And his response was, he fired her. We can't have you there. I don't want the idea of a man wearing a dress at work. That's going to be distracting to families who come to the funeral home, and you're fired. That is sex discrimination. That also just the fact that someone is transgender and is transitioning, you're not going to be able to conform to gender stereotypes, and then you're protected. So that's very, very strong basis of law, and that's what the Civil Rights Commission was basing this on. In the meantime, there have been a number of federal courts that have looked at incidents involving gay and lesbian discrimination, and they've also found that to be sex discrimination. Another good thing that happened was in November of 2018, the Michigan voters elected a governor, an attorney general who also identifies as a lesbian woman, and a secretary of state, all who had records of being supportive of the LGBT community. First time that I can recall in 20 years, almost 20 years I've been working at the ACLU of Michigan, that we have leadership in our state that, in the most significant titles in our state government who are supportive of LGBT rights. And Governor Whitmer, on January 7th, she signed an executive directive that did 3 things. The first thing said is that LGBT people cannot be discriminated against in state employment. So when they apply to work for the state of Michigan, terms and conditions of state employment, they cannot be discriminated against. She also said that employers that have contracts with the state of Michigan, they cannot discriminate against their LGBT employees either. So if you want to contract with the state, you have to adhere to this non-discrimination policy. And then finally, the executive directive said that when LGBT people are accessing government services, they cannot be discriminated against. That's very significant because many times I get a lot of calls from members of the transgenders who are having difficulty getting their Medicaid insurers to cover their medically necessary care because often those insurers have discriminatory policies. Now there's a remedy to do something about that. We hear sometimes from inmates in the Michigan Department of Corrections who believe they're being discriminated against because they're LGBT. This would also provide a possible remedy for them. We've had problems in the past with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services targeting lesbian couples who have children through a sperm donor. In the past, the department was arguing that the sperm donor was an absentee father and requiring the lesbian moms to try to go after the sperm donor for child support. Those kinds of things could be challenged, those kinds of practices. Probably it's not going to happen now with this administration, but certainly it happened under the Snyder administration. So now there's some remedies. And once again, Governor Whitmer based her executive directive on this line of case law saying that discrimination against LGBT people can be sex discrimination based on gender stereotypes. So that's a very important, these are very important developments and very, very significant. I should also say that during the Obama administration, many of the different governmental departments, they also interpreted federal civil rights laws that way. And so the U.S. Department of Education said that transgender kids were protected under a law called Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in education. The Department of Justice said that LGBT people were protected under sex discrimination laws. So now let's talk about the challenge. We have a new administration, Trump administration, that is taking a very different viewpoint and a different interpretation regarding sex discrimination laws. So I told you about these great developments, but all of that is at risk right now. Because that case I told you that we had involving Amy Stevens, the funeral home applied for cert. They petitioned for cert from the United States Supreme Court. By the way, you just can't automatically go up to the United States Supreme Court. You have to petition for a writ of certiorari, and 4 justices have to decide to take your case. And they did. And they're looking to see whether or not sex discrimination laws cover transgender people. In addition to our case that's going to go before the United States Supreme Court, there are 2 cases involving gay men who were discriminated against. One is called Zarda, that's out of New York, where a flight instructor was fired from his job for being gay. The court held that that was sex discrimination. And another case out of Georgia called Bostic, involving somebody who worked for the state of Georgia who was fired from his job, he believes because he was gay, where the court said sex discrimination laws don't cover gay and lesbian individuals. So these cases are going to be heard sometime in October. And what's different now is the Trump administration, Department of Justice, they're arguing, despite all this case law, a federal precedent talking about gender stereotyping and LGBT people, they're arguing that sex discrimination laws do not cover LGBT people, do not protect them against discrimination. Should the United States Supreme Court reverse the favorable decision that we got, or the one in Zarda, they say sex discrimination laws don't cover LGBT people, this can upend all the gains that we've made. And so this Department of Civil Rights could not take, Whitmer's executive directive could be challenged. And if you happen to live, don't specifically prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and you're going to be out of luck unless your legislature laws. We've been trying for almost 30 years to get them to add the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity to our civil rights laws. We've been unsuccessful. The current leadership in Lansing, the Senate leader, Lee Chatfield, has said he will not put forward any legislation, he will not move forward any legislation that would add those categories. And so this is what we're facing. So do we have something to fear from the United States Supreme Court? I think we need to be very cautious about this. Last year, Justice Kennedy retired from the United States Supreme Court. He was known as a fairly conservative justice on many issues, but he was always the justice that crossed over to vote and to write the opinion in favor of LGBT rights. In other words, Justice Kennedy wrote the marriage equality decision striking down a portion of the Defense of Marriage Act, which is the opinion that struck down same-sex sodomy laws that criminalize consensual sexual relationships between same-sex partners in states. He was also the justice that would prohibit a state from passing civil rights laws for LGBT people. Justice Kennedy is no longer there. And Justice Kennedy was replaced by Justice Kavanaugh, who certainly does not have a reputation of being supportive of civil rights. And now we have Justice Gordon, members of the court who are quite conservative and wouldn't be considered moderate on most issues. So we're cautious and we're a little scared what could happen here. Just as you've heard, concern about people who are pro-choice and in terms of what's going to happen with the right to have an abortion as a result of this change on the court. And then, of course, now you have an administration that is arguing that LGBT people aren't protected under federal civil rights laws. So it's a big change of a scenario. And it's an example. It's an example. I hope you take nothing else from what I'm blabbing about tonight, is that elections have consequences. And anytime you talk among yourself or people that you know and they say it doesn't make a difference who I vote to, you got to set them straight, so to speak. You have to let them understand there is, before November of 2016, there was a whole different school of thought of how much further we could go with LGBT rights, depending on who won the election. And this whole scenario has changed. We are finding ourselves in a very defensive posture. We are finding that we have to intervene in cases that we wouldn't even want to get involved with because of these challenges. And I'm going to continue on with my litany about some of what these challenges are. So let's go back to 2015. We get this great marriage equality decision where the United States Supreme Court majority says that the right to marry and the benefits of marriage is a fundamental right that same-sex couples are entitled to, historic. And for many groups that opposed LGBT rights, this was a significant blow. And it, for many years, what they were fundraising on, what they were getting their membership on, was on this: we've got to prevent gay people from being able to get married, from getting to be part of this sacred institution that only heterosexual people should have. So they lost on that. And they began to recalibrate their strategy. How do we stop? How do we stop these LGBT rights? How do we stop this train that seems to be proceeding forward? And the way they recalibrated their strategy is two ways. And now they have an administration that to both the strategies. The first is to use religion as a basis for arguing you should. So many of you are probably familiar with the Masterpiece Cake case that the Supreme Court heard last year, where a baker who is open to the public was saying, I shouldn't have to bake a cake for a same-sex couple because of my religious beliefs that marriage should be limited between a man and a woman. And you might have heard about a florist who says, I shouldn't have to do a floral arrangement for a lesbian couple who's having a wedding because of my beliefs and my feelings about that. Now, it's interesting with the Masterpiece Cake case, because a lot of decided and said that the baker wins, the baker's allowed to discriminate. That's not exactly the thing. And once again, we had Justice Kennedy to kind of work out this compromise and write this decision. Justice Kennedy, the important things that Justice Kennedy said is that when you're open to the public, you have to serve the whole public. You can't pick and choose. You can't put a sign on your bakery, we'll serve everybody except people with blue eyes. You don't do that. That's not how laws work in this country. And the second thing that the majority said is that states have an interest, a compelling interest in enforcing civil rights laws. And people are entitled to have their sincerely held religious beliefs, but when you voluntarily enter the realm of commerce, you're subject to laws, including civil rights laws. So that's very significant. What the court also did was they made by a civil rights commissioner in Colorado about religion, and they felt that it was hostile towards religion. And so they reversed the Civil Rights Commission's judgment against the baker. So it made it seem like the baker had won. But that's very significant because what the commissioner said was that in the past, sometimes religious beliefs have been used to discriminate against people, including racial discrimination. And what we're starting to see now, so the court considered that to be a hostile statement. And what we're starting to see now is people alleging because of their religion, they should be allowed to discriminate, and that certain comments of public officials are hostile to religion. Sometimes based on really benign types of things. And so if I can illustrate this just as examples in Michigan, what's been happening in our state, almost 2 years ago, we filed a lawsuit against the state of Michigan. So the state of Michigan, when they do foster care and adoption care, they agencies to provide those services, to help recruit foster families, adoptive families, to provide trainings, and to place children in homes. And so when those agencies that are contracted and paid with taxpayer funds, they're essentially agents of the state of Michigan. And those agencies can include faith-based agencies. That's fine, anyone who's willing to adhere to the terms of the contract. But what was happening was the state of Michigan knew that there were certain faith-based agencies that were refusing to work with same-sex couples. And the state actually had them sign contracts that said they wouldn't discriminate based on race, based on religion, based on sexual orientation, and gender identity. These agencies said, yeah, we won't discriminate, and then they turned around and discriminate. So we contacted the state of Michigan, the Attorney General, said, Bill, this practice is going on. Do you want to sit down and talk about this? And their response was, no, we don't want to talk to you. Go ahead and sue us. So we did. We sued the state for allowing this practice to go on. These are agents in the state of Michigan who are refusing to work with same-sex couples, so that violates constitutional principles. And also, religious viewpoint, the state is putting forth a particular religious viewpoint which violates separation of church and state. So, while this case was going on, one of the faith-based agents, they intervened in the lawsuit. The court let them intervene as a defendant in the lawsuit. And post-election in November, the new Attorney General, Dana Nessel, came to us and said that the state of Michigan is no longer going to permit agencies that they give a contract to discriminate against same-sex couples. So the judge, he dismissed the case. And then what happened was St. Vincent Catholic Charities turned around and filed a new lawsuit in a new agreement. Challenging the settlement agreement, saying that by enforcing this agreement, that it was singling out religious entities for discrimination. So it's individuals and institutions portraying themselves as being victimized by having non-discrimination policies that cover LGBT people. And then another group, Catholic Charities of Western Michigan, they filed a lawsuit against the state of Michigan, arguing that this violates their religious freedom. Now, there's no constitutional right to get a contract from the government. The government can condition receiving a contract saying you can't discriminate against people. But this is this attempt to try to erode, in terms of civil rights laws. This is nothing new, trying to use religion. Back in the 1964 past, you had restaurant owners in the South arguing that their religious belief was that God put races on separate continents, and therefore they shouldn't have to serve African Americans at their restaurants. The courts didn't buy it then, and they shouldn't buy it now. And yet, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's happening with our federal courts. We have an administration, the Trump administration, which has been issuing these so-called exemptions for religious entities with regards to foster care and adoption services. In South Carolina, they granted used to work with a Jewish family because they have an agency. So it's not just attacking LGBT people, it can be an incredible slippery slope. Another example of the lawsuit in the state of Michigan, Williamston, a school district, public school district, right outside of Lansing. Their school board passed a non-discrimination policy for all students that included sexual orientation and gender identity. A group of parents turned around and sued them, saying that by having this kind of policy, this LGBT inclusive policy, that discriminates against these parents based on their religious beliefs. Their religious beliefs that to be LGBT is wrong, that it violates religious principles, and they feel by having this policy, this interferes with their ability to instruct their children in the religious principles that they hold. And so we're seeing these actual proactive attempts to try to prevent. So as an example, what could happen in Jackson, and what we've seen in some cities around the country, is lawsuits being brought by people in a community who don't like a local human rights ordinance that covers LGBT people and saying that it violates their religious freedom. And sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. And of course, eventually, the case will probably go up to the United States Supreme Court to look at that. So how do we break this all down? You know, what I find so frustrating is when people try to be exempt from various laws. All you have to do is say religious freedom. A lot of people think they get that. But when you try to explain that this is non-religious activity, this is not about, you know, a church directing how you hire somebody who does ministerial functions or anything like that. This is about things that are open to the public. How do you break that down so people understand? So I bring up this baker. Okay, baker wants to open a bakery shop in Jackson. What does he have to do? Well, first, the zoning board. They have to make sure that it complies with zoning ordinances, and they have to approve the plan. And then they're going to build the bake shop. And they're probably going to send the city inspector out to periodically check to make sure construct baker to open. They're probably going to do a health and safety inspection to make sure that everything, you know, meets those standards to be preparing food. And then when that baker hires employees, he's going to have to deduct monies out of the paycheck that goes towards Social Security. He's going to have to pay payroll taxes, and he's going to have to comply with civil rights laws. Because keep in mind, once you provide an exemption on one particular law, you know, it's open season for any laws. And while some people might be comfortable with a particular religious belief that's associated as a Christian belief, I'm not so sure they're going to be supportive of a belief that might be a Muslim belief or a religion that's not as well recognized or as well accepted in this country. So it's a very, very dangerous thing that is happening here. And you might have heard, well, I'm going to get into that a little bit more about what the administration has recently done with allowing for these more exceptions. So what do we have to do is we have to speak out about this. And we have to talk to people, because what we find is when we explain this argument and we talk about what religious freedom means, most people do get it. And they say, you know what? Freedom of religion is very important. It's protected under our Constitution. There's nothing that the government can do to try to take away someone's religious belief. But we have never, and our Constitution has never allowed it to be used as a sword to harm other people. And that's what this is what this kind of attempt is trying to achieve. So let's talk about the second tact. I'll never forget when I first started here in 2001. I remember attending, it was a very hostile panel discussion about LGBT rights. And I remember listening to some of the statements that opponents were, you know, who were on that panel were making about LGBT people. That gay and lesbian people were pedophiles. And they were just out to try to recruit your children and to turn them gay or lesbian. And, you know, now we look at a lot of that stuff, and I think people think that's pretty ridiculous statements, which of course they always were. But what's changed with gay and lesbian individuals is more and more people know someone who's gay or lesbian or who is bisexual. It could be a family member. It could be a friend or a colleague at work. And so marriage equality just didn't happen because the court made a decision. It also happened because of the changing of hearts and minds. More people thinking, you know, there's no reason why my friend and his partner of 25 years should be denied the opportunity to have their relationship recognized and protected under the law. And so a lot of the arguments that opponents use by demonizing gay and lesbian people were no longer effective. So they decided to target transgender people, because the awareness about what it means to be transgender and the visibility of transgender people is less. Probably the transgender civil rights movement is 15 to 20 years behind the gay and lesbian rights movement. And so there was an opportunity to try to mythologize and demonize transgender people. In other words, a trans woman is a man who just decides one day, I'm going to put on a dress. and I'm going to go to the restroom, I'm going to sexually assault your daughter, and untrue as that is, it's been effective. It's been effective in campaigns. In Houston, they rescinded a local LGBT human rights ordinance using that argument. We don't want to protect those transgender people. Those people are sick, and they're gonna sexually assault you. And we've seen examples where North Carolina passed a bathroom bill that said, you know, what it says on your birth certificate to be able to use a public restroom. Legislation introduced in Michigan. We did. It fortunately didn't go anywhere, but I always try to bring it back to our state so you realize we're not so far away from some of the crazy stuff that other states. So by dehumanizing transgender people and creating this kind of fear against transgender people, usually associated with the bathrooms, we've seen attempts to make bad public policy or try to strip transgender people of civil rights. I want to give you a list regarding transgender people in less than 2 years. In the first couple of months of the Trump administration, the first thing was the United States Department of Education rescinded guidelines concerning transgender students and their ability to use bathrooms in accordance with their gender identity. And subsequent to that, the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Education will no longer take any complaints involving discrimination against transgender students. They say, you know, see if you can find a court that, well, we will not look at this. We won't even investigate that kind of complaint. You probably heard that President Trump, via a tweet, reinstated a military ban preventing transgender people from enlisting, from openly serving, after the Obama administration had done a several-year study showing that it had no impact on military readiness and had rescinded that ban. And that's now in place. The Supreme Court has allowed that to be in place while it's being appealed. The Trump administration has also, the Department of Justice has come out with guidelines saying that transgender people are not protected under federal civil rights laws involving sex discrimination. You might have heard there's been a memo, it hasn't officially been released, that was going around that the administration would change the definition of sex, saying that a person's sex is what was initially assigned to them on their birth certificate, which would have the effect of essentially erasing transgender people from any form of recognition under any federal government programs in terms of acknowledging them or that they cannot be discriminated against. You might have heard that there were federal prison guidelines concerning transgender inmates saying that you needed to take into account the safety concerns of a transgender inmate and their gender identity and gender expression when you make housing decisions. That was rescinded. So now we're kind of back to where we were. Transgender women is housed with the general male population, can be at risk for rape, sexual assault, physical assault, etc. The Trump administration, you might have heard, they did a double whammy last week. They issued guidelines concerning the Department of HUD, which gives money for homeless shelters, and they are allowing for homeless shelters based on religious beliefs to be able to turn away transgender people, and that shelters can require that transgender people have to be housed in a facility based on what was assigned on their birth certificate initially at birth. So in other words, a trans woman who comes to a homeless shelter would not be, they could say, you can't stay with the women, you'll have to stay with the men, you'll have to use restrooms and bathrooms and showers and things like that with the men. New guidelines. And Friday issued guidelines concerning the Affordable Care Act, which is the federal law that increased access to health care, but also says you can't discriminate against people in the provision of health care, and insurance companies cannot discriminate. And what the Trump administration did was they reversed the Obama administration, which said that LGBT people were protected under federal civil rights laws for purposes of access to health care and insurance policies. So what that means now is certainly faith-based hospitals could turn away LGBT patients if they don't want to provide certain treatments to them, and insurance companies can refuse to cover medically necessary transition care for transgender people. If that wasn't enough, a couple weeks before that, the Trump administration issued finalized rule concerning conscious guidelines for medical providers. In other words, a medical provider can refuse to provide medical treatment to an individual based on their religious beliefs, regardless of what there might be the health consequences. So this is what has happened in less than 2 years. And the list isn't over. There's more happening. We expect the Department of Labor to come out with new guidelines about federal government contractors that have contracts from the federal government. In other words, allowing them, because in the Obama administration said, if you get a contract from the federal government, you can't discriminate against LGBT people in your practices. What we're hearing is the Department of Labor will now offer exemptions for employers. If you can cite a religious belief, you don't have to comply with that provision. So what a difference. What a difference in 2 years make. But let's talk about, what do you do when these policies come out? Presidential administration can't undo, they can't rescind a law. They can't undo federal court precedent. That has to happen from the federal courts. Now, when you're elected president, you have the ability to appoint any vacancies on the federal court. These are lifetime appointments. Not only the United States Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeals, Circuit Court of Appeals, as well as all the district courts. And I wanted to give you some examples. What we've seen in the past 2 years is that this administration has been packing the courts with judges who predominantly have past records of being against LGBT rights. So, the Trump administration, I'm going to read this so I get all my information right. Trump administration has more than doubled its number of confirmed Circuit Court of Appeals judges in 2018. Over 1 in 3 of the administration's court nominees have a demonstrated history of anti-LGBT bias. 85% of the Circuit Court of Appeals nominees are members of the Federalist Society. Now, the Federalist Society is a group. They interpret the Constitution. They believe that if it wasn't specifically written in the Constitution, that you can't interpret a provision of a Constitution covering a group that maybe the Founding Fathers weren't thinking about. I doubt our Founding Fathers were thinking about LGBT people. So that's not to say that all Federalist Society judges are anti-LGBT, but I think it's pretty clear to say that they're going to be very unlikely to interpret our Constitution as providing certain protections and rights inherent in the Constitution for LGBT people. Some other information. Today, almost half of the 12 Circuit Court of Appeals are composed of 25% of Trump judges. 2018 has seen 8 times more confirmed federal district court nominees than in any previous administration. So this administration has been able to confirm more federal judges in less than 2 years than any previous presidential administration that we can think of in the history of this nation. That's significant. That's very significant. So just as an example, the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals, 2 years ago, you could go before then, you'd say, well, you get a panel of 3 judges, you could say, well, maybe it's about half and half. Maybe progressive judges, conservative judges. That whole balance has changed. So this is very important because we have checks and balances, as you can see, in our government, and yet we're not seeing some of those checks and balances happening in terms of policy. So there is legitimate concern about what's happening with all this. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do? Well, we need to really renew our efforts around Elliott Larson, because in the event, should the Supreme Court decide that sex discrimination laws don't cover LGBT people, we need those specific protections. And just this year, the U.S. House of Representatives passed, every Democrat voting in favor, plus 18 Republicans crossing over, the Equality Act, a comprehensive federal civil rights law that would protect LGBT people in the areas of employment, in public accommodations, in education, in housing. Senate Leader Mitch McConnell said he's not going to even put it forward. He refuses to put it forward. And so my next thing to say, we have to vote. We have to make sure that we vote. We have to make sure that anybody who cares about our lives, who calls himself an ally or a supporter of us, We need to make sure they get information and they make an informed vote. If you've ever been in a conversation with someone and they tell you, it doesn't matter who I vote for, it doesn't make any difference, just give them an example of what's happened in the past 2 years and the challenges that our community is facing. That has to mean something. But we have to get that information out to people so they know about that. You know, a great thing that also happened in November was voters approved a ballot initiative that would allow and make it easier for people to participate in voting. In other words, you're automatically registered by the Secretary of State's office when you get your driver's license, unless you choose to opt out. And that anybody, for any reason, could get an absentee ballot. So anybody says, well, I have to work today, I can't vote. Doesn't matter, you can get an absentee ballot, you can vote. We estimate that as a result of that ballot initiative, 400,000 to 500,000 more voters can participate. And if you know what the election results were in 2016 and how Michigan went, you know this can make a significant difference. So I don't mean to be all gloom and doom, but I really want to sound a warning, an alarm, because I don't think we get that in the media, and we're going to go out and we're going to celebrate pride as we should and who we are, but we have to remember, and we've come a long way in the last 50 years since Stonewall, but we also have to remember there are significant challenges facing us, and we have to be engaged, and we have to be informed, and we have to try to have conversations with people who care about us and who we care about so they understand what's happening here. Because it's true, in any civil rights movement, for steps you take forward, sometimes you're forced to take some steps back. But it's pretty significant what's happening here. And it's pretty significant, the people who are making these decisions at the federal level, many of them clearly have histories and professional reputations being opposed to LGBT rights. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to erase some of those gains. And I think probably 20 years ago, some supporters of pro-choice would think, the court will never come back and look at Roe v. Wade. That'll never happen. And I told people, after the 2016 or 15 marriage equality decision, and after the elections in 2016, I said, I don't think the court will look at the marriage equality decision. I don't think they would come back, but I don't know. I don't know. Because if there are more vacancies on the United States Supreme Court, and all you need is a majority on the Senate, 51 votes to confirm a Supreme Court justice, a lifetime appointment, I just don't know. We're starting to see in Texas there's a challenge arguing that yes, gay people can get married, but no, the state shouldn't provide benefits associated with marriage. A legal challenge. So that's the opening salvo in trying to roll back that. So I've said a lot of things, and I want to leave some time to answer questions that people might have. Any questions, comments? Yeah. Tom raised his hand first.
I beat you. First and foremost, we're going to bubble wrap Ruth Gator.
Yes.
We're going to put her in bubble wrap and save her.
Yes.
Secondly, what are your thoughts on the recent refusal to hear the case about the transgender bathroom?
Thank God. Grateful, very grateful. I forgot to mention that, I had in my notes. So there's a school district in Pennsylvania, Boyertown, and the school district, they had a policy allowing transgender students to use restrooms in accordance with their gender identity. And a group of parents sued, saying that it violated the privacy rights of their children who didn't want to be around other transgender students in the bathrooms. And I don't believe they raised a religious freedom claim in that case. But the federal courts upheld that policy, and those parents wanted the United States Supreme Court to take up this case, and we're especially leery about the court taking up any bathroom case. There were not the 4 votes to take up the case, and so they're going to leave that ruling standing. And that's a very important statement. This issue comes up a lot. And what I think might be going on is Chief Justice Roberts, who's very conservative, is also concerned about the reputation of the court. If the court takes on too many controversial issues, they already have 3 LGBT cases they're going to hear. I think, they were able to dissuade, a fourth vote from wanting to take up that case, because it's too much. We do think eventually the court might decide they want to take one of those cases. The way things have been, if this administration continues with some of their policies and their actions, it might be before the Supreme Court, but not at this point in time. So it's like, whew, that was a piece of good news. Carl, then we'll get you.
Yep, Tom pretty much touched on what I was gonna iterate about Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes.
She's getting up there in age, so it's very.
And her
important
health-wise,
on the
right.
road. And one other thing, I'm an activist, you know what I've been doing for years. I've heard from the gay community and the lesbian community put downs on the transgender community.
Yeah.
And it's very, very important that we all stick together as one. We cannot discriminate against ourselves.
Absolutely, and there's been efforts in the past. So 2014 was the first time amending Elliott Larson seemed like it was going to go a little further. It actually passed out of one of the committees, and the leadership said, we're not going to do that unless you take out gender identity, protect transgender people. And fortunately, the LGBT community said, no, we're not going to allow part of our community to be discriminated against. I've heard those comments too, sometimes made by some friends of mine. It's all about opponents not letting us be our authentic selves, being who we are. That's somebody else because they don't need a gender stereotype, but don't. And I think of the three cases that are going before the United States Supreme Court, probably held a good Stevens, because in all the circuit courts of appeals, there's no disagreement that transgender people are covered. Whereas with gay and lesbian, you don't have as much case law and stuff. So in many ways, transgender people and their cases and their fights for their rights have been pioneers for rights that have benefited our community. And just look at the Stonewall, 50-year Stonewall. Who were the people that were involved in that uprising of that bar in New York in 1969? Who were members of the transgender community? Who were the ones that said, we are not going to take this anymore? So to turn your back on that or to act like that doesn't exist is just, it's unfathomable to me. I know it happens, and it's wrong, and it shouldn't be tolerated in any way. And don't you know that the opponents of LGBT rights, the thing they would like to do more so than anything else is divide us. Because when you divide, you conquer. And if you try to say, we'll help you, you acceptable gays and lesbians out, but we don't want to deal with those people. So, and I think sometimes it deals with race issues too within the LGBT community. So a lot of racism in the community, and those who might have privilege based on their sex or based on their race, sometimes are making decisions that don't always take into account other members of our community who there's a lot of intersectionality in terms of economics, in terms of race, in terms of gender. Yeah.
Sort of going forward with that, when I was in my early 20s, I often was told I was in the wrong bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't identify as gender fluid, I didn't identify as trans, but women would tell me I was in the wrong bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
So when these kinds of cases come forward, and people in the gay community, well, it does affect gay men who maybe present more feminine,
right,
or lesbians who present more masculine, or me. I mean, I was like 5'1", 100 pounds with short hair. Like, I wasn't necessarily presenting masculine.
Right.
I just wore kind of androgynous clothes and my hair was short. And that was in the early 80s.
Yep.
So my feeling is, they're going after the low-hanging fruit. because they can, no pun intended, because they can go after transgender people and, like you said, divide and conquer in the places where they can divide and conquer, but also because a lot of transgender people are people of color and live below the poverty line.
Are homeless.
And there are a lot of gay white men with a lot of money.
Right.
who can fight back
Right.
in terms of political contributions and all of that.
Right, and can also help to magnify and elevate the voice of the transgender community. You said it perfectly. It's so true, and you know, it's no coincidence, and we've seen this rise of hate crimes in our country in the past 2 years, but also a rise in the murder of trans women of color. Just last week, Malaysia, who was murdered in Texas, and
After being beaten.
after being beaten. And certainly these policies that keep coming out of this administration, sometimes twice, 3 times a week, it's just a cruel, it's almost like kicking someone who's already been kicked out.
It's important to make sure that allies understand, because I was like, it was primal fear the day after the election, and a lot of my straight friends couldn't understand.
Right.
I'm like, you don't understand, it's a rogues gallery of homophobes.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming after us,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll come after us first.
Right, right. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about transgender bathrooms in high schools. And something that some of my transgender friends have said is that when they come to the administration, the school administration, they say, I'm a transgender man or I'm a transgender woman, I would like to use this bathroom, I am asking for your protection. They say, well, you can use these bathrooms, you can use these specific bathrooms. Does that violate the discrimination ordinance?
I would say it does. I would say that's not acceptable to say you can use the gender neutral bathroom in the nurse's, the nurse's office, or you can get the key and use the one down the hall. That's not acceptable. There have been case law that has said that trans kids are covered under Title IX, and that to deny a transgender student to use a restroom in accordance with his or her or their gender identity is sex discrimination. Is concerned about their own privacy, using a bathroom or using a locker room. The school district should provide alternative, bathrooms and things available for them, but they shouldn't put it on the trans student, because it marginalizes that student and it sends a message. It's only acceptable for you to go to a different bathroom so people don't have to see. Listen, bottom line is, you talk about the fears, any inappropriate conduct in a bathroom can always be addressed by a school. Trans students are using bathrooms for the same reason as any other kid. So I would want to hear from any of those students who get that response from a school district, and we will write a letter and we'll try to persuade them to do the right thing. Yeah.
Wasn't there just an issue over transgender in the bathrooms?
In Grass Lake? Yes. And what happened was, the school district was doing the right thing. They were allowing, I think it was a transgender little boy in kindergarten to be able to use the boys' restroom. And what was happening is they were threatened with a lawsuit from some parents in the district, making those same arguments about privacy. I think also maybe some religious freedom arguments that were raised as well. And so what happens is, even when you have a local government or a school district that wants to do the right thing, like in Williamston, it's the threat of a lawsuit, which costs money, even if there isn't a validity to that lawsuit, it costs money to defend. And so my fear too is that some school districts, some local governments will be dissuaded from doing the right thing because of these proactive challenges that we're seeing from opponents. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sure.
It is traveling season, obviously, and my husband and I are wanting to travel throughout Michigan, because I'm not from Michigan. I want to explore.
Sure. It's a beautiful state to travel.
Right, I'm ready. Being that not every city has an NDO, a non-discrimination ordinance, what would be the best advice you could give my husband and I, or any other person that comes from a city with an NDO in traveling? What should we do if we're denied lodging because simply we're gay?
I filed a complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights because, as the Civil Rights Commission has said, LGBT people are covered under our state civil rights laws based on sex, and the Michigan Department of Civil Rights will accept complaints. So if you wanted problems with the hotel, you know, saying, you know, for whatever reason, they're not gonna let you stay there, or any type of discrimination, file complaints with the Department of Civil Rights. Yeah.
I had a question in regards to the foster care cases that are
Mhm.
before. My husband and I actually had our home visit today through DHHS to become licensed foster care parents.
Yeah.
And while I understand the current administration is very LGBTQ friendly, in accordance with, you know, saying you were concerned whether or not they would revisit the Marriage Equality Act and things like that,
Right.
what sort of issues or potential problems could you foresee going forward for LGBTQ families either wanting to adopt through the foster care system, act as foster care families, and what have you?
Mhm. I foresee the threats from this current administration that is allowing states to get exemptions to comply with civil rights laws, like what we saw in South Carolina. There was a lawsuit that was just filed against that particular exemption. I fear that this particular this administration could threaten to take away certain funding to states if they don't allow these kinds of exemptions. Yeah, and I fear lawsuits like that were filed. So it's interesting about our lawsuit. We pretty much settled it. And the time for St. Vincent Catholic Charities to do something and say they disagree with the settlement was before that judge on that case. They didn't. They kind of went forum shopping. And they filed in the western side of the state because they know that the judges are much more conservative there. And they thought they may be able to, you know, they're arguing the same arguments they argued in our case, but they figured maybe they picked a better forum. They found a judge who's gonna be more sympathetic. So I fear that we'll see more of these things. But you know, but the bigger fear that I have is that we have 13,000 kids who linger in the foster system who need homes. And this should be all about the best interest of children. And when you decide you take a family out of the potential pool who might be able to provide a safe, stable, and supportive home for these kids, you're harming children. What this practice does is it elevates the religious beliefs of a state-contracted faith-based agency above what might be the best interest of children. And that's what's wrong. It's putting that before actual child welfare.
It is, considering that in Jackson alone, there are 360 plus children in foster care systems, and we have less than 20 licensed families.
Wow.
That means these children have to go to places like Pontiac, Detroit, Flint, because they're in these group homes, that these children, and specifically LGBTQ youth,
Right.
end up being phased out of the system. Abuses aren't necessarily reported, and things like that make it significantly more difficult for there to be this transparency and, like we said earlier, the elevation of these very important issues, and that we're trying to be pushed by the wayside.
Yeah, no, and you brought such a good point. The foster care system never ascertains what might be the sexual orientation or gender identity of a child who is a ward of the state. So there, you know, and when you don't do that, you might need an LGBT family to provide you the support. As an example, but also a foster care system. Jerry Peterson, the ED, was telling me that usually the kids that come there in their foster program, they've had about 6 unsuccessful placements that were not supportive. So by the time they get there, they're about 15 or 16, and you can't find them a permanent home. They just age out of the system. And that's wrong. That's totally wrong. And, you know, mind you, these faith-based agencies, in a private capacity as an adoption aid, they can work with whoever they choose to work with. But you don't have a constitutional right to a government contract. The government can set certain conditions and criteria regarding, including that you don't discriminate against people. And it's so out of whack, this whole idea. And of course, these agencies, they say, if you don't let us do this, we're gonna have to shut down and the whole foster care system is gonna fall apart. It's interesting to note, there are only 2 faith-based agencies that I know of in the state of Michigan in the past who have refused to work with same-sex couples. There's 90 different foster care and adoption agencies that get contracts from the states, and who would be more than happy to get more contracts from the state should one of these agencies say they have to leave. But usually what happens is they don't leave. They might rebrand, or for instance, Bethany Christian Services. Since the settlement agreement, they've said they will work with same-sex couples as a result of the settlement. So, Yeah.
How much does Bethany charge for that service? $25K a head?
I know that what they get a government contract and in terms for doing
I know
home
for
studies
adoption,
and
if you
things like
send them a
that.
check for 25,000, they'll cash it and you can pick up the kid the next day.
Well, that might be a private adoption capacity, but all agencies get whatever the state contractual
Okay.
rate is based on their services. They don't provide, they might give more contracts to a particular agency, but I don't think they provide a higher rate based on the
Sleazy.
agency.
Correct.
Yeah.
Could you explain to me what kind of legal precedent the Trump administration thinks that they can impose in the two cases that are going on right now where surrogates were involved in the birth of a child,
Mhm.
one in Canada and then a sperm donor in Italy? In which so that it's a lesbian couple, I think, in Italy, and it's a gay couple in Canada. And now the Trump administration is saying that those children do not have citizenship rights because they are not the biological combination of both parents.
The surrogate mother was from Canada.
The
Yeah.
surrogate mother
Yeah.
was from Canada,
I
and
think the term they were using was born out of wedlock.
yes.
Yes.
So how do they, I mean, because if I
So
were
I-
a
I-
single
right.
woman and I gave birth outside of the country,
Mhm.
I'm a US citizen, so by default, my child would be a US citizen.
Mhm.
So I don't understand how they can make this claim, because it violates like all kinds of,
Well, I think sometimes there's been an attempt just to define solely based on biology who a parent is, when we know that's not the case, right? And it's kind of sometimes antiquated family law that hasn't kept up with the diversity of families and what exists. You know, I don't have an easy answer what the logic that they're doing, but obviously there are people in this administration that have an agenda where they don't want LGBT individuals to have these certain kind of protections, to be recognized, to be acknowledged, to be treated the same as other people. And they pretty much infiltrated many areas of the administration. And I don't know if the president has a particularly strong view decisions, you know, pretty effectively, you know, from the Department of Justice through all the different departments, this is kind of going through. But just as an example, an issue involving, it's called equitable parenthood within our community. So even before marriage equality, there were many LGBT couples that were in long-term relationships having children, even though only one parent was recognized at law. And so they're raising the children together, and like heterosexual couples, sometimes they break up. But unlike heterosexual couples, you know, through marriage, where if you have a custody dispute, you go to court and you hash it out. If you're not recognized as a parent, by law, the legal parent can just take the children away. And the only remedy you have is that you can try to go into court, but what's happened is that there's a concept called equitable parenthood. It's a judicial concept. In other words, Michigan courts came up with that. And they said if you can establish that you had a parent-child relationship that was fostered by the legal parent, you lived with the child, you financially supported the child, it's in the child's best interest, you'll be an equitable parent. Good enough. That means maybe same-sex couples can qualify. But our Michigan Supreme Court limited that doctrine to a legal marriage 20 years ago. So at that time, same-sex couples could not get married. And so we saw these tragic consequences whereby, mostly it was usually moms, would lose their kids. And they try to go to court. The court would dismiss it, saying you have no standing to challenge this. And they wouldn't see their kids ever, or maybe when the kid turned 18, as an adult, could make their own decisions. So after the marriage equality decision, we tried to go back on behalf of, you know, some of these couples that broke up before marriage equality to try to get equitable parent rights. We were successful in the lower courts, but the Michigan Court of Appeals reversed and said, no, you have to be married. And you should have gone out of state to get married, even though that time Michigan would not have recognized your marriage. So it's crazy. So a lot of times we think marriage equality just made everything better. It certainly did make things better, but there's a lot of collateral damage left over from all the years of denying recognition and existence of LGBT relationships, including families. A lot of harm was done to them.
but if it were a heterosexual couple who are not married, who went through the sea with somebody from out of the country, would,
They might also not wanna recognize that. They should get married, you know? They should've got married.
They're bastardy laws.
Right.
but so the children would, there could be questions about their citizenship then.
And their inheritance.
I guess so. I mean, listen, if they want an outcome, the arguments in our cases before the Supreme Court are twofold. One, that in 1964, when Congress passed Title VII, they were thinking about transgender people or gay and lesbian people, and most of the country wasn't thinking about that. But that's not how we interpret law. We don't ask the Supreme Court to psychoanalyze the mood of the country when a particular law was passed. You know, it's usually even the most conservative, plain meaning language. If a decision was made about employment due to someone, sex, then that's what the action was because of that. So it'll be very interesting, and hopefully everyone will stay tuned and listen to the arguments and the things that are raised. I think we talked about Justice Ginsburg. She's probably going to be one of the strongest advocates on that particular issue. But there's plenty of other justices who are going to be very suspect. And one of the advice that we've received is, don't try to get some members of the court to understand what it means to be transgender. That's the other thing. And this is Jan's soapbox. We are a diverse nation, and our judges should reflect that diversity. And when you only have a bunch of white men, middle-aged men, serving on courts and stuff, living in their own particular silo, they can't possibly necessarily relate to what's going on in the world. And that's why it's so important that our government reflect the diversity. Anything else? Yeah.
So, if, God forbid, you lose your case,
Mhm.
the court basically decides that sex discrimination does not include LGBT
Yeah.
discrimination. I think earlier you said that would basically overnight do away with any protection that we have here in Michigan.
Based on sex discrimination.
But
So in other words, the interpretive statement from the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, that would be suspect. Governor
Well, couldn't that still
Whitmer's.
stand though? I mean, couldn't they interpret the state statute how they want it?
Well, so in their interpretive statement, they cited to federal case law. Our state court has not interpreted sex discrimination to cover LGBT people. And that's what I didn't share with you for the first, and up until now, our Michigan Supreme Court has been overwhelmingly conservative. There's 7 justices, it's usually 5-2, 6-1 conservative majority. It was virtually impossible to successfully bring any civil rights claim in the Supreme Court. It's changing a little bit now. Now it's like 4-3. Sometimes you have judges that are crossover over. But we had one of the most ideologically driven Supreme Courts about 10 years ago. They did a survey from one of the law schools, and they found our court to be one of the most politically biased state Supreme Courts. And that's because we elect our justices, and you get the ballot, it says nonpartisan, and that's a lie. They're nominated by political parties. And many times those candidates share some of the philosophy of the parties that nominate them. But most of us don't know. We just, vote. Oh, incumbent, they're on the court, I haven't heard anything bad about them. I'll elect them for 8 more years to serve on the court. And that's problematic too. Most states do not have political parties nominating their judges. So, back to your question. I didn't mean to go out on a tangent.
That's all right.
If they do reverse to get specific civil rights protections, and to try to amend our laws and hopefully elect legislators who are going to be supportive of that and that will let that go through. But it would make it difficult if it was based. So both those things were based on citing federal, court case law that would be overturned. So, yeah, Tom.
How important is it for us to be counted in the 2020 census?
Very important. That's right. No, thank you. I didn't list everything. Yeah, orientation, one's gender identity. You need to have that statistics. And being counted is not only for the numbers, but also to be recognized, and it can impact funding for different programs and things like that. Once again, I think it's an attempt just to deny the existence. Let's go back to the good old days when we didn't even know LGBT people existed. I've heard Michigan legislators say to me, I don't have anybody in my district who's LGBT. should I even be concerned about that issue? So if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. Remember the first day of administration, the webpage, the White House webpage that had any reference to LGBT issues was
Taken down.
immediately removed, taken down. So that was kind of a little bit of foreshadowing of what was to come. But once again, you know, we have a voice. People who care about us have voices too. We have a vote. We have to participate. Yeah.
I actually have a question on that.
Yeah.
Given sort of the tumultuous political landscape, what advice do you really have for members of the LGBTQ community and our allies? What specific steps can we take to help bolster these arguments and add forces, as it were, and help ensure that our rights are protected?
Yeah. Well, we have to speak up. We have to speak up. I don't know who your elected officials are in Congress or at the state level, but I think that starts there.
We have the wonderful gentleman that says climate change is in God's hands.
Yeah, yeah.
And healthcare too.
Right.
So
Healthcare's in God's hands too. Well, I think, you know, in terms of next year's election, in terms of finding candidates that are going to be supportive, and making sure that people get information. That, you know, while we celebrate Pride, let's also make sure that people are aware that there's a lot at stake, and there's some, you know, we can still celebrate who we are and being ourselves, but also recognize the fact that there's some challenges ahead. And
Give you a vendor form so you guys.
The problem is there's so many prides. It's like ours. Definitely let us know, because I'm glad yours is in August, because everybody's in June this year, it seems.
done on
We'll
purpose.
save you a spot for the parade too.
What's that?
We'll save you a spot for
In the parade? Great, great. Yeah, I think it's just visibility and trying to have those conversations with people, especially our allies. I was talking with my mom, and we were talking about the HUD, the shelter thing, and she said, oh, I don't, and she's very supportive, very progressive. Transgender people said, Mom, they do. And I showed her statistics that, you know, I can't remember exactly what this did, pretty high about transgender people reporting 60% who went to a shelter being either turned away or harassed because of who they were just in the past year. And it's getting information so people know, telling our stories. I mean, it's hard to tell our stories when we fear discrimination, but people who are able to tell their stories.
And transgendered migrants being put in solitary confinement.
Yes.
Well, in prison too, and jails
Yeah.
often too. They say for their safety, but you shouldn't have to be in solitary confinement for that because of your safety. There's other ways to provide protections. And absolutely.
We'll just kill you now so you don't get murdered.
Right. And I think we also have to remember there's a great intersectionality in our community. So issues involving immigration, I hear from members of the LGBT community who are immigrants, who are having issues related to that. Certainly race issues, certainly the criminal justice system. They just came out with a report looking at different police departments. Detroit got terrible marks for lacking certain policies and practices. Issues involving incarceration, economic justice. Average income of a transgender person is less than $14,000 a year. Not much to live on. And some even below $10,000. Gay and lesbian couples are disproportionately living below the poverty level for various reasons. A lot of it was due to the lack of legal protections for their relationships, but still, you know, discrimination that people encounter too. So it's the whole ball of wax. And so a lot of times when you hear people talking about access to health care, that is an LGBT issue. I can't tell you how many transgender people are not getting the health care they need due to the insurance companies refusing to cover, despite what doctors say, despite what the medical experts say.
Or just finding a compassionate position for
Yes.
any LGBTQ person, because, you
Right.
know, for women, inevitably, it's the, you know, sexual encounter.
Right.
Because they want to screen, you know, and then you have to often come out to get the treatment that you
And it
need.
can be very uncomfortable, absolutely. And with this new conscious exemption, it can make even and you know, sometimes we just assume everybody lives in a big urban area and there's a lot of providers and stuff. But Michigan is, you know, we're spread across geographically in rural areas when there's no place to go, you know, you don't have any choices. Yeah.
So, yeah, related to that, in Michigan right now, some insurance companies do cover these things, I know that. If, again, if the Supreme Court overturns your case,
So, because there's other things involved. So in other words, let's say it's a Medicaid program, designates it a Medicaid. So Medicaid, federal Medicaid law says you have to cover medically necessary services, and medical necessity is based on what the patient's medical treatment team says is medically necessary and what's the expertise in that area. So even without the sex discrimination protections, one can make that argument that, you know, you're violating federal law because you're not following these types of things. What happened was, well, long story short, a couple of years ago, the Department of Insurance and Financial Services, there was a case challenging this section 1557 is protecting transgender people, and a judge issued an injunction in the case. And what DIFS did is they issued a bulletin saying, this means that transgender people are not covered or protected against discrimination, which was wrong. And what happened was a lot of the insurance companies started having blanket exclusions on covering. And that went all through last year. And then finally, Michigan Medicaid said, no, you can't do that. So it's a lot of times, sometimes it's bad advice. Sometimes the insurance company will look to that and say, oh, that means we can change, you know, we can change our coverage of services. So, yeah.
What about communities or parents are saying that LGBTQ curriculum is against their parental rights?
Right. So the law has always said, the case law has said, certainly community input can be part of a school district's curriculum, but individual parents don't have the right to veto a particular curriculum based on a particular religious viewpoint. They can choose to opt out of things. It's interesting about the Ellendale School District. We did a letter to the district based on that radio story, and we heard back from the superintendent, and he said, you know what, we're no longer doing the abstinence-only sex education program. We got rid of that program. We developed a new program. And he claims that they did not remove anything from anti-bullying materials that included LGBT kids. And we requested, under the Freedom of Information Act, all the materials that they use this year. And there is mention of LGBT students. So I don't know what happened with that story, but I think it is reflective of what's happened in a lot of school districts where they're afraid to even mention the name LGBT or to talk about that stuff because of threats of lawsuits and you know, opposition from parent groups.
So if a school district is having those difficulties, or they're having like a group of parents that are threatening, you know, a lawsuit, what can like parents or other community members that disagree with it do? Speak up,
give support to the school board members. A lot of them, you know, worry about, you know, will they get recalled or will they lose in the next year's election? If they know that there's support there, just your voices to be heard. There's, they did in Saline School District. Oh, you're from Saline? Okay, yeah. And it's hard, those things, because you have to listen to some of the horrible things that in Williamston, I attended a couple of these meetings, and I felt so bad for the LGBT kids who had to sit there and listen to that stuff. And so you know what happened? Finally, the woman who was coordinating, she said, we're not gonna sit through this anymore. So she had everybody come up and stand behind her, and she said, you know, we've said our piece, this is where we stand, we're standing in solidarity, and we're walking out. We don't have to listen to this stuff anymore. And that was a strong statement. But yes, the visibility and having people show up and to speak out in favor. And if it's hard to sit through some of those community meetings, contact school board members individually, you know, arrange an appointment to meet with them and to have those discussions and conversations. It doesn't always have to be in a public forum like that. Yeah.
On the subject that she was talking about, do you know anything happening in our country where people are trying to fight for like state, what would you call it, like like a state mandated curriculum that includes LGBT education?
Well, in certain states like California, they had a state mandate, and it was challenged in court, but they succeeded. And I think New York too, I think they include that in their educational programming. It would have to be a statute, but Maine too as well.
Massachusetts.
Yeah. So you're progressive code things, right? Doing that. And of course, it can be up to an individual community what they want to include in their curriculum too. And certainly, if the community indicates that it's important that some of these topics be covered, that could possibly happen.
That's where it's important to vote for your school board.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's very hard for LGBT kids because often they're not recognized, they don't see themselves in any way, shape, or form in school materials or discussions on anything. And it sends a message that you are other and that you're not like everybody else because we can't even talk about you.
There's gay kids who don't know what Stonewall is, don't know
Right,
what Marjorie
right,
Johnson
right.
is.
And one of the ways we can counterbalance that is through gay-straight alliances, right? That provide an opportunity to share that kind of information. And hopefully through community centers that might have youth groups and things like that can also do presentations and provide information. So you're in Washtenaw County?
Me?
No. Yeah.
No, Jackson.
Oh, in Jackson. So maybe the Pride Center, I don't know if they have a library or if they're working on getting a library together or some kind of, there's films and stuff that, there's the film Stonewall and there's some other things that have that information. Fortunately, we have the internet and people can access some information.
Movie Trans is a good movie.
Yeah, I don't, yeah.
You've never seen
I
it?
didn't see that one.
Oh, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Being a gay man, I always got the G,
Yeah.
and I always got the B, and I always got the L. But I didn't quite understand the T part until I saw that movie.
Sure.
And it all came together.
Yeah, yeah. And it's just,
Understand completely.
right. And it's so interesting. I was sharing some statistic with this representative and was saying, where trans people are supported, there's groups that support them and they're able to get identity documents that reflect who they are. Just the outcomes in terms of well-being, it's so significant. If we just let people be themselves and decide to leave them alone, things can be so much better. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so offering something to include more LGBT
Yes,
materials
yes.
in the curriculum, including at like the younger, and we're advocating for at the younger grades.
Sure,
Like,
because kids are coming out at a much younger age.
8 through 5, yeah, especially with the trans piece of it. So legally, is there any, what are the legal issues as far as opt-out notice, parental rights? It's just, the district basically can do what they want, right?
The district can set forth a curriculum, and if a parent, so part of this is this whole idea that LGBT people, just even the mention of them is automatically sexualized. In other words, so the argument is, if you say the word transgender, you're talking sex, and it's how do you separate that? But there's not a clear established law. What I would say is just offer, that students can opt out of certain things.
No case law has provided any guidance on what is and isn't sex education.
I don't know, to be honest with you. I probably not in the context of LGBT people. Other things might. Certainly the argument of opponents have been made, you just mentioned the word and it's sex education automatically. And we saw it was the Ingham County Intermediate School District that got in trouble because the teacher talked about transgender people in a classroom. It was a after school group. It was a non-curricular club, but the argument was that this was sex education. So I think at this point in time, the ability to be able to raise these issues, sometimes it depends on what subject is being taught about and in what context it is. Certainly if you're talking about social studies and you're talking about the fight for same-sex marriage, that would be hard-pressed to say that that's sex education curriculum. But I'll never forget that panel thing that I went to when I first started. There was a trans woman, and she was just saying I'm transgender, and this woman spoke. She said, "How dare you throw your sexuality at us just by saying I'm a transgender woman?" And so once again, it's this attempt that LGBT people are only defined based on their sexuality.
Yeah, I'm sure teachers that, are in a same-sex relationship or marriage don't feel like they can speak to their kids in the classroom.
I think many are afraid. I think the argument should be that teach whatever's appropriate for a heterosexual teacher to talk about their family. I remember when I was a kid, I loved it when my elementary school teacher had pictures of her family or his family on the desk, and you could ask questions and things like that. I liked seeing that sort of thing, and I imagine that same curiosity, but you're absolutely right. And there's not real good established case law about what an LGBT teacher can say about themselves or talk about in the classroom. This is still something that's developing. Hopefully if you have a good union, good union representation and a school district that is being supportive. Whole other issue, we won't get into that, is what do you do when a teacher wants to be supportive of an LGBT student, but the student's parents aren't supportive? In other words, parents don't want their child to be referred to based on their preferred name or preferred pronouns, things like that.
Well, the state has guidance for that. I mean, there's best practices, which.
I think they try to
districts
encourage a
follow.
dialogue with parents if that's at all possible. But what do you do? Because I've got some calls from teachers. A teacher gave a trans student a book about a trans kid, George, and complaints from the parents to the school district about that. So a lot of this stuff is still developing, and sometimes the law won't be able to answer the questions succinctly. It'll have to be people kind of sitting down and trying to talk it out and work it out too. Yeah.
Jay, in stemming from Mark's statement, a lot of people, even people our own age, still don't know about Stonewall and about gay history or LGBT history. I happen to be a huge proponent of history
Yeah.
in the LGBT community.
Right.
And in stemming from your question too, no, we do not currently have a library.
Mhm.
We have books,
Right.
but we don't have the library built yet.
Sure,
That's
sure.
being worked on.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, if you go back to the 1970s in California, when there was an initiative that tried to fire teachers simply for
Great
being gay or
initiative.
lesbian.
Right, right.
And basically, we're still facing that today.
Mhm, mhm.
Still a law in the books in Ohio.
What's that?
If you're a teacher and you say you're gay, it's a violation of morals code, you can be fired.
Wow. Well, there's also, there's laws, we don't have that, it's called the no promo homo law. In Arizona, in school curriculum, you cannot present materials that depict the gay lifestyle in a positive light. And that would be, considered to violate the curriculum code. So you're right, we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go on some of this stuff. And I have to remind myself, not that Detroit is the bastion of progressiveness or anything like that, but sometimes when you come to other communities, the issues are pretty much basic, about fears and stuff. But the one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that we do have a remedy. If you're discriminated against in the state of Michigan, you can file civil rights complaints. And you should. And the director is very, very much wanted this to happen, was happy with the result, and very much wants people to contact them.
We know Auntie Linda Thomas very well.
Oh, yeah, she's great. She was there last week. She was there at the forum.
Which, on behalf of Jackson, I want to apologize for how you were greeted at
Oh.
some of the questions on that panel.
Oh, no, it was just the one question. It happens. I mean, we have to have these discussions, and we have to recognize that, these are very polarizing times, and trying to find some common ground.
Really trashy too.
I friended that gentleman.
Did
on
you?
Facebook.
Oh, good, okay, and you accepted?
I haven't heard back yet. so-
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think too that it's important because when people know people who are
Yeah.
in the community, they
Yeah.
change their minds. So we have a unique opportunity here in Jackson to integrate ourselves into the larger Jackson community because it's so small.
Yeah.
And so we can change a lot of minds just by being good citizens in Jackson.
Right. I overheard someone saying there's some event coming up in Jackson, maybe you guys having a table there. That's great to show that visibility, that the LGBT community is there, the Jackson County Fair, whatever, that stuff going on, that we're here, that we exist. That's very important. Maybe you could host a reading of something at the library one night, too.
we have a
Well,
full
I'll
month
talk
of
to you
stuff.
after the talk.
Yeah. No, I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
Bring in some or maybe the library would be willing to feature some LGBT themed books or something
Yeah.
for Pride Month.
You know, I'm 65, and I've learned a lot in those 65 years. And one thing that sticks out in my mind, every family that I know has an LGBT person in it, whether it's an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister. Somewhere in that family structure,
Right.
there is an LGBT person.
I
You
think you're
can't
right.
find a
I
gay
think you're
cousin,
right.
you are the gay cousin.
You know, and it's really interesting you bring that point up. One of my husband's family members was named Claude Cleveland. And not only was she the first female licensed barber in the state, she was also the first licensed bank president that was a woman in the nation. In her biography, they completely and entirely leave out the fact that she lived with a woman in 1920s Addison, openly as a lesbian.
Yeah.
The Decker and Sons Insurance Agency, who talks about how they piggybacked off of her after she bought an insurance company out, talks about how she was such a conservative pillar in the community, but left out immediately that she had been a lesbian.
Yeah.
It took my husband's grandparents buying a headstone for her wife to make sure that she was recognized there.
Yeah. And I think, I'm sure some of that's generational, the ability to even talk about that sort of thing. Even in Hollywood for many years, people felt they couldn't be out. It would affect their ability to get parts and
Rock
play
Hudson.
parts. Right, to play romantic lead and or not to be pigeonholed, and so, yeah.
Or the famous roommate clause.
Right, exactly,
Yes, or
exactly.
what was the phrase, mustache?
Beard?
A beard, there we go, thank you. Sorry.
I know what you mean. Any other questions or comments? This is a great discussion, you guys. Thank you. Thank you for coming here tonight.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. We're trying to go around the state and do many forums and to just give updates and stuff about what's going on so people are aware. And no better time than during Pride Month.
Right. All right, everyone, thank you for I suppose anyone has a private question, if we have a, you wanna come up and do that?
Yeah, real quick.
We have a, let's get our calendar, we were talking about what we're doing, we
Yeah.
have our calendar.
Yeah, let's hear about your
So-
calendar.
Okay, we're gonna do a little bit of a shameless plug here.
We're plugging this up.
Okay, as we all know, June is National Pride Month, so we are stacking the month full of activities for stuff for our community to do, both here and afar. June 1st, Ferndale Pride is the first in the state. Please, go visit them.
It's a lot of fun. It's like a big street fair.
It is. My husband, I'm taking my sister-in-law and her wife there this Saturday, and we're going as delegates for Jackson Pride. The second, which is Sunday, we're gonna have our float again in the Rose Parade, third year,
Yep.
and hopefully we'll win it again, 2 years in a row. On Wednesday, June 5th, we have, each year we're going to try and reach out to the community and have a community conversation. I owe you a quarter, Terry. We're having a community conversation in which we're reaching out. We kind of want to know exactly how we're doing in the community. We want your thoughts. We want your actions. You were there last year. You were there last year, Michael. Let's see. On the 12th at noon, First Congregational Church here in downtown Jackson. Third year. This will be the third anniversary for the Pulse Massacre Memorial. At noon, they ring the bell 49 times for the 49 lives that were lost. At 6 p.m. that same night, in this very room, we have Unified. They are the HIV and AIDS organization here. They're going to be teaching us about the history of HIV, where it is today, prevention and maintenance. On the Thursday the 20th, we have a health resource fair. Yeah, we didn't come up with a better name for it, but we have a slew of agencies that are willing to come and speak to us, similar to the college fair that we had in March. There will be a round table, podium in the middle. They'll introduce themselves, and you're free to go and seek out information from them. The 27th, Thursday, we have a history project for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. So please invite your friends, your family, come learn about Stonewall before and after. Our community obviously goes a lot further back than just 1969. And we've done a lot since then in the 50 years since Stonewall. The 28th, which is Friday night, we are having a candlelight walk, because that is the actual 50th anniversary. We'll have a candlelight walk around downtown Jackson, beginning at 8 p.m. in front of the library, walking downtown. Coincidentally, they have the car show going on at the same time, so we will get some coverage.
Yeah.
That next Saturday, the 29th, we will have 2 movies, before Stonewall and after Stonewall, here at 12 o'clock. And then our first ever at the Oak Tree Lounge on Sunday, the 30th, we will have a tea dance.
A what?
Tea dance?
The
A
Oak
tea
Tree
dance.
Lounge. The Oak Tree Lounge is on Oak Street. We'll post everything.
Tom,
Pause for one moment and define tea dance.
you have to redefine tea dance for the
So-
people, the youngsters here who don't know what a tea
Never
dance
Back-
is.
T-Town. Oh
No,
my
well,
God.
he's not even out of high school yet.
Well,
But-
I was there.
So yeah.
Different
Um,
time.
yeah.
I wish.
So back in the day when a lot of people went out to the clubs, they went out Friday, Saturday night, and then, you had to sort of pull it together to show up for work on Monday, but you could squeeze in
That
one
one
more
last
good
party.
few hours, 4 or 5 hours of dancing, if you started the day at 4 p.m. and you danced till like 9 or something. Then you'd get home, get yourself straightened up, and get prepared to go back to work on Monday.
Or go out for
And-
dinner
And
after.
so that sort of late afternoon, early evening, were billed as tea dances. And that's where it came from.
So if you didn't know, the Oak Tree Lounge is traditionally closed on Sundays. They are opening
you
they're
guys,
opening
that's wonderful.
especially for us.
Wow.
They are opening their bar for us. And on Sundays, when you went to the beer bus or to the tea dance, that was known as going to church. So, one last thing too, real quick. On Thursday, July 11th, we have a representative. We just got it confirmed today. We have a representative from the Census Bureau that is going to come and speak to the community
Yeah.
about how we can get ourselves counted in the 2020 census. It's not going to be one event, it's going to be a string of events. So we can be counted in everything. Yes?
Is all the stuff going to be on Facebook as much as I hate using it?
Yes.
You know what? Everything will be on Facebook as well as our Instagram, Twitter, and
Website.
Our website, yes.
Okay, cool.
And August 18th through the 24th is our Pride Week, culminating in the Pride Festival on August 24th, preceded by a parade that morning. And so we are looking for people to volunteer, vendors to put tables out, and
Food truck
nonprofits,
vendors.
food truck vendors, and also sponsors.
So consider this
Guys.
the summer of love.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.